This might take a while.
Brian, it's your turn to take the dog
What?
out. Brian.
No, I can't.
Brian.
I can't hear you. I'm sorry. It's super loud over here.
Here, try this. Brian, can you hear me this time?
Yeah, I can hear you. This is great.
Much better. Can you go wash my car?
Oh. Alright. With full modularity, 80 plus platinum efficiency, and whisper silent operation thanks to a semi-passive 0 RPM fan mode, the new Fractal Design Ion Plus is the ideal power supply to make sure you don't miss what's going on in the world around you. Check out the link below to learn more. Before we get into it today, if you like the content on the BPS Customs YouTube channel and you want to see more of it, be sure to get subscribed and hit that little notification bell down there. Also consider supporting my one-man show by visiting the merchandise store at bpscustoms.com. Now, this is a decision that I feel a lot of you have had to make recently or are going to have to make soon. Which motherboard to pair with your new Ryzen 3rd gen processor? With the 3000 series really sticking it to Intel on basically all fronts, including core count, price, and overall performance, the DIY PC market is skewing heavily towards AMD platforms for the first time in like a decade. Of course, Ryzen 1st and 2nd gen made big splashes, but I think with chips like the 3600X and the 3900X, AMD has really come into their own, and consumers are looking to them as the primary choice rather than as the alternative. However, the biggest sticking point this time around might be the corresponding motherboards. While it's certainly true that you can use an X370 or an X470 board with a Ryzen 7 3700X, ideally you'd want all the new features these boards offer, like better power delivery for higher core count chips, as well as PCIe 4.0 for faster transfers across the PCIe interface, especially helpful when it comes to blazing fast storage. So while of course this isn't the entirety of the X570 market, it's a decent representative sample of several price points and feature sets, and I want to just quickly run through them and see what they have to offer. We won't be testing each one for performance, as that would make for an extraordinarily long video. But to be completely honest, I've found that because of the way Precision Boost Overdrive works in boosting 1 or 2 cores up to 4.3, 4.4, or even 4.6 gigahertz in some circumstances, the stock settings for these chips is often the best one, especially considering the additional power and thermal requirements of an all-core overclock. Now, that's not to say that you can't overclock or that you shouldn't, but for most people, the stock settings are going to be where it's at. So let's start at the least expensive product here and work our way up the line. I want to thank MSI, Gigabyte, Asus, and AMD for providing these samples for us today to look at here on the channel, and you can find links to all this stuff down in the video description. Keep in mind that this will be a relatively high-level overview. If you want a more detailed breakdown of every chip soldered to the PCB of these boards, I highly recommend going over to Buildzoid's channel, Actually Hardcore Overclocking, where he'll spend 40 minutes talking about each motherboard. First up is Gigabytes X570 Gaming X. Coming in at $169, I still hesitate to call this inexpensive, but comparatively, it's well under what you might expect to pay for an X570 board on average. For this reason, I think B550 boards will be huge sellers when they debut, either later this year or maybe early next year. The Gaming X has a fairly stripped down set of features compared to the others on this list, and nowhere is that more apparent than when looking at the rear I/O. It does have a fixed I/O plate, which is great to see as a feature that's kind of trickling down from higher end products. But the connectivity here is sparse, with only 6 total USB ports and no USB-C. You also, for some reason, get 2 legacy PS2 ports, which I don't quite understand the logic behind. The rest of the Gaming X looks okay, but I'm not sure what to think of this geometric pattern that has kind of propagated itself all over the place. I guess that is a matter of personal preference. The VRM design is a 10+2 phase, but the heat sinks used here are just kind of chunks of metal, which is better than nothing, I suppose, but won't give you the absolute best performance. Listed memory support on the QVL maxes out at 4000 megahertz, which is much higher than what we saw with Ryzen or even Ryzen 2. So just 2 years ago, we were well below this, but this is still the lowest memory support of any of the boards we'll look at today. For storage, you have the option of using up to 6 SATA ports or 2 M.2 slots. It does give you BIOS flashback support, so that's a handy add-on. The good thing about even the lowest end X570 boards is that you can likely use them with any Ryzen 3rd Gen chip. It's just that maybe you're overclocking or PBO support that might be lacking. Then again, if you're buying a 12-core 3900X for $650 or whatever, I doubt that you'll be looking to cut costs on your motherboard. I'd recommend this for low-end system builds for the most part. Moving up to $200, we have the Asus TUF Gaming X570 Plus. We see some significant improvements here in basically every area of design over the Gaming X, with the only thing lacking on the TUF board being a fixed I/O plate. You will need to be able to tolerate a little bit of yellow here and there, as well as some digi-camo. But if that's not an issue, this is a really well put together product for the price point. The I/O is more robust with 7 USB ports, both DisplayPort and HDMI, and Wi-Fi. And yes, you still do get one PS2 port for those of you still rocking an IBM Model M keyboard. It does lack BIOS flashback, which is unfortunate, but memory support is bumped up to 4400 megahertz. You get 2 M.2 and 8 SATA ports for storage, as well as the same VRM design as on some higher-end Asus boards like the Prime Pro and the Strix E. It's a 4-phase VRM, but each phase has 3 power stages, meaning that overclocking support, even for the higher-end chips, is willing and able. The VRM heatsinks are slightly smaller than on the Strix models, but overall this board would be a perfect fit for a Ryzen 5 3600 or even a Ryzen 7 3700. We're going to move up in price, but go down in size for our next motherboard, the Gigabyte X570i Aorus Pro Wi-Fi. So basically the name is bigger than the actual product, which is tiny. It's one of the very few mini ITX boards on the market right now. I'm sure we'll see some more fairly soon, but smaller form factor is getting more and more scarce with each generation. So enjoy the good products while you can, and this is certainly one of them. As with all X570 motherboards, the X570i does come with an active chipset fan, and due to the overall size, this one is smaller than normal. It has an 8-phase VRM with 70 amp Infineon power stages, which is an overkill design even for something like a 3900X, and thanks to BuildZoid for that little tidbit. The I/O shield is fixed in place, making for one less building hassle. And the back panel has 6 USB ports, 2 HDMI, and 1 DisplayPort output, as well as Wi-Fi and BIOS flashback. There are 4 SATA ports and 2 M.2, one of them is on the back, which is kind of standard on a board of this size. Listed memory support goes up to 4400 megahertz and 32 gigabytes for the 2 DIMM slots, so you can make yourself a powerhouse little system build with just this tiny thing right here. Just make sure that your CPU is getting enough cooling inside of your ITX case if you go with a higher core count option. We tick up a bit to around $240 for the second Asus motherboard on the table, and one that I just finished a monthly build with, the Prime X570 Pro. Asus also makes a different Prime board, the Dash A, but this one is more fully featured and of course more expensive. August monthly build used this with a 3600X, but truthfully almost any Ryzen 3rd Gen CPU will be right at home here. As mentioned earlier, this shares a VRM design with the TUF and the Strix boards, but changes around a couple of other things. You get a fixed I/O in white this time with 8 total USB ports, but we are lacking a few important features seen on less expensive models, namely Wi-Fi and BIOS flashback. The white aesthetic is definitely appealing, and you get some nice RGB effects in several spots. But you do have to make the decision if that is more important to you versus some features that are lacking on a motherboard that is this expensive. You do get SLI support for the first time on this list, but that's kind of going away anyway. Storage options are 2 M.2 and 6 SATA ports, and listed memory support is again up to 4400 megahertz, a fairly common number for this class of product. I think the main selling point here is the look of the Prime Pro, as while I still actually really do like this motherboard, and I'm glad that I used it in a build, it lacks some features that we find on less expensive products. For $200, you can get a motherboard that does almost everything this does, and in some cases even more. so this might be kind of a hard sell. As we crack through the $300 barrier, we find ASRock's X570 Tai Chi, which actually costs exactly $300 as of the filming of this video. This is one of the boards that AMD sent over with the Ryzen 3000 Reviewers Kit. And over the past few months, I've used it in several different scenarios, and it's proven to be quite capable. For starters, it looks pretty great and has that unique gear accent over the chipset, along with a bunch of RGB effects in some different spots. It has a fixed I/O plate with 8 USB ports, BIOS flashback, and clear CMOS, and Wi-Fi. We see power and reset switches on board for the first time today, along with a digital postcode readout, which I've found myself kind of leaning more and more on over the years. The Vrm design is again very solid with a 12+2 phase setup, and you get memory support up to 4666 with certain kits. Storage is also very strong with 3 M.2 slots and 8 SATA ports. Of course, you can't populate all of those at once and expect full speed, as you'll kind of be saturating your PCIe lanes very quickly, but the option is there nonetheless. This is the point where I'm pretty confident in saying anything from here on out, you should feel good about pairing with any Ryzen CPU, up to and including the upcoming 16-core 3950X. Gigabyte's third and final appearance on this list is again for a product that AMD provided to reviewers, the X570 Aorus Master, and I see that these are now out of order. It's a hell of a motherboard, and I used it for all of my Ryzen testing because of how solid and reliably it was performing. It has really nice aesthetic covers over the actual finned VRM heatsinks that cover a 14-phase digital VRM. Memory support goes down just a bit to 4400, but the amount of people that will matter to is pretty minimal. You get Wi-Fi, clear CMOS and BIOS flashback, 10 total USB ports, and dual LAN ports around back on the fixed I/O. On board, there's also power and reset switches and a postcode readout. 3 M.2 slots are covered in the provided heatsinks, and you can expand your storage to the 6 SATA ports on the right edge. There's an ESS Sabre DAC as your audio solution as well, meaning higher fidelity music and in-game audio. Yes, it is on the higher end of the price chart at $360, and for a while it was hard to find them in stock, but having used the Aorus Master extensively, I can highly recommend it for almost any application. We're almost done here as we move on up to the $370 Msi Mega X570 Ace. MSI has several really high-end motherboards for this generation of AMD products, and they've introduced their godlike lineup over to Ryzen for the very first time. This is the step down from that, the Ace, but it's still extremely fully featured and looks pretty damn good as well. The VRM is a 12+2 phase and is completely overbuilt for any application. Cooling them, we can see a beefy heatsink connected by a copper heat pipe down to the chipset, allowing the heat load to be spread around more effectively. Maybe the weakest part of the X570 Ace is that it only has 4 SATA ports, but you can supplement that with 3 M.2 drives. The rest of the surface sports a postcode readout, power and reset switches, and an OC dial, which you should never use, but it's still there, and technically it is a feature. There's also gold text all around and a really neat infinity mirror design over the I/O. You get 8 USB ports along with Wi-Fi, dual LAN, and BIOS flashback buttons, and of course, the new trend of a fixed plate. Memory support is listed as at up to 4800 MHz, and if you're spending $370 on a motherboard, maybe you're also spending $500 on a kit of memory that can actually run that fast. And finally, we come to the most expensive product on this table, and likely the most expensive X570 motherboard that you really should consider buying, Asus's ROG Crosshair 8 Hero Wi-Fi. This beast is $380, and while you can get it in a formula variety with a VRM water block, it's about $700 for what is otherwise the same exact thing as this. You can also splurge on an MSI Godlike or Gigabyte Aorus Extreme, but the gains are minimal and the costs are astronomical. This guy right here does it all. It looks dope with all the black and silver accents, and I like what Asus has done over the I/O shroud here with the Hero logo. VRM design is 7+1, which sounds like not that much, but there are 2 stages per phase, meaning that it's actually beefy enough to handle a 3900X without even really needing a VRM heatsink at all. Not that you should run it that way, but that just speaks to how capable this board actually is. It has a lot of features tailor-made for not only quote-unquote regular guy overclocking, but also for LN2 users. There's a slow mode switch, which actually makes your CPU run at its lowest multiplier, as well as a safe boot button, which loads you into the BIOS without wiping all of your settings if you're taking an overclock a little bit too far. Of course, you do get all the high-end features that you might expect, like a power and reset switches and a postcode readout. It has 8 SATA ports and 3 M.2s for storage, and memory can run at up to 4800 MHz according to the QVL. The I/O is also loaded with 12 total USB ports, BIOS flashback, and clear CMOS, Wi-Fi, and dual LAN. So that's it. Which X570 motherboard is right for you, and what processor are you pairing it with? Sound off in the comments down below. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I hope this video helped you guys out in some way, and I will see you next time.